All right, so part two of Americans' entrance to the world of imperialism. So again, just a reminder, beginning with the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, the U.S. had taken a special interest in problems of the Western Hemisphere and had assumed the role of protector of Latin America from European ambitions. So Benjamin Harrison's Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, played a principal role in extending this tradition. Blaine's repeated efforts to establish closer ties between the U.S. and its southern neighbors bore fruit in 1889 with the meeting of the first Pan-American Conference in Washington, D.C. Representatives from various nations of the Western Hemisphere decided to create a permanent organization for international cooperation on trade and other issues. Blaine had hoped to bring about reductions in tariff rates. And although this goal wasn't achieved, the foundation was established for the larger goal of hemispheric cooperation on both economic and political issues. The Pan American Union continues today as part of the Organization of American States, which was established in 1948. And one of the most important uses of the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century concerned a boundary dispute between Venezuela and its neighbor, the British colony of Guyana. In 1895 and 1896, President Cleveland and Secretary of State Richard Olney insisted that Great Britain agree to arbitrate this dispute between Guyana and Venezuela. Arbitration, for those of you that may not be familiar with this term, is when the disagreeing parties use an independent person or group to help reach a settlement. The British initially said that the matter was really none of the U.S.'s business. However, the U.S. argued that the Monroe Doctrine applied to this situation. And just as an aside, I always find the invoking of the Monroe Doctrine fascinating because remember, this was just the U.S. making a declaration that they and nobody else would be the protector of the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't some kind of multi-country treaty signed by other nations. Man, diplomacy can be a fascinating topic. It's kind of similar to planting a flag in the ground and claiming territory, right? Anyway, back to Cleveland and Olney. The U.S. threatened to send military force if the British did not arbitrate. Great Britain ultimately decided that its relationship with the U.S. was more important than its long-term interests with this boundary dispute in South America. And so the British do agree to the U.S.'s demands. And as it turned out, the arbitrators ruled mainly in favor of Britain, not Venezuela. Even so, Latin American nations appreciated U.S. efforts to protect them from European domination. Spoiler alert, unfortunately, this feeling will not last too long on account of the U.S.'s involvement in Latin America. Probably the most important in this Venezuelan boundary dispute is that it marked a turning point in U.S.-British relations. From 1895 on, from this event onwards, the two countries begin cultivating a friendship rather than continuing their formal rivalry. And this friendship is going to end up being very beneficial to both nations during the tumultuous events of the 20th century. Okay, the Spanish-American War. We're not going to cover all of it in this video, but we are going to talk about the lead up to the Spanish-American War. And next video, we'll talk a little bit about the fighting and the effects of the war. So a principal target of American imperialism was the nearby Caribbean area. Remember, expansionists from the South had coveted Cuba for some time. And now in the 1890s, large American investments in Cuban sugar, in addition to Spanish misrule of Cuba and the Monroe Doctrine, all provided justification for the U.S. to intervene in Cuba. So in the 1890s, American public opinion was being swept by a growing wave of jingoism. Jingoism is probably one of my favorite American history vocabulary terms. I don't know why, it just sounds pretty cool. But jingoism is an intense form of nationalism that calls for an aggressive foreign policy. And unfortunately, the term jingoism has recently been revived in our discussions of current events. I wonder if you guys have happened upon it when you are so vigilantly reading the news. Vigilantly, there we go. You can't even read the news. I can't even say the words for you. All right, moving on. So, jingoism, keep an eye out for it. Expansionists demanded that the U.S. take its place with the imperialist nations of Europe as a world power. Not everyone favored such a policy, though. Presidents Cleveland and then McKinley were among many who thought military action abroad was both morally wrong and economically unsound. Nevertheless, specific events combined with background pressures led to overwhelming popular demand for war against Spain. So let's back up a little bit and discuss why we are talking about Cuba in the first place. Cuba had been fighting for its independence from Spain for some time. Cuba tried unsuccessfully to break colonial rule between 1868 and 1878 during a 10-year-long rebellion, which was eventually suppressed. They renewed this struggle under the leadership of a man named Jose Marti in 1895. Through sabotage and laying waste to Cuban plantations, they hoped to either force Spain's withdrawal or pull in the U.S. as an ally. In response, though, Spain sent the autocratic General Valeriano Weyler and over 100,000 troops to crush the revolt. Because much of the resistance was through guerrilla-style tactics, and again, guerrilla-style warfare is something that is very common in a common trend that we see in revolutions. They're fought by the people, they're not fought by organized military, and as such, these are just everyday civilians, and using these tactics like sabotage or, like sneak attacks, essentially, to wear down the military. So General Weyler basically says, okay, well, this is being fought by civilians. I can't trust any of these civilians. So he has them rounded up and placed into reconcentration camps. He puts them in one area. This may sound very familiar to something that you have covered in world history. Unfortunately, and not surprisingly at all, tens of thousands of Cubans die of starvation and disease in these reconcentration camps. Such behavior, not surprisingly also, earned the general the title of the Butcher in the American press. And speaking of the American press, it should be no surprise that they played an active role in inciting war fever. Hearst and Pulitzer, who I introduced in the last video, again led the charge for inciting American jingoism by publishing false accounts of Spanish atrocities in Cuba. Now, that's not to say that what Spain was doing to the people of Cuba wasn't atrocious, but the stories the Yellow Press ran were usually all fabricated and carried very little substance. An example of which I posted on this slide. The headline reads, "Spaniards search women on American steamers." And as you'll note in the sketch, that this is not just like an average search. This woman is being stripped down among men. That this created, not surprisingly, a very visceral reaction in America, that their women are about to, are threatened. So, believing what they read in their daily newspapers, many Americans urged Congress and the president to intervene in Cuba for humanitarian reasons and to put a stop to the atrocities and suffering. I do want to note also that there was some kind like a link to American thinking that Cubans were revolting against this the autocratic rule of Spain, and that's very similar to when the colonists revolted against the monarchy of Britain. So that there was some kind of empathy that was going along for that as well. One story that caused a huge storm of outrage was a Spanish diplomat's letter that was leaked to the press and printed on the front page of, what a surprise, Hearst's The New York Journal. Written by the Spanish minister of the United States, a man by the name of Dupuy de Lome, the letter was highly critical of President McKinley. Many considered this an official Spanish insult against the U.S.'s national honor. People's reaction to this letter is kind of similar to the feeling that you get when somebody says something about your family. Like, you could go on like a 15-20 minute rant about your family to your close friend, but heaven help your friend if they actually end up agreeing with you. Like, yeah, you're right, your mom does do this. No. That's not okay. So yeah, the United States was ticked. They felt the Spanish had slighted them and that in order to renew their honor, they needed to step in and assert themselves. This is very similar to that dueling culture that we talked about in the antebellum South. Less than a week after the DeLome letter made headlines, a far more shocking event occurred. On February 15, 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine was at anchor in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, when it suddenly exploded, killing 260 Americans on board. The yellow press was not surprisingly, very quick to accuse Spain of deliberately blowing up the ship, and Americans typically embrace this story. In reality, though, we really don't know what happened to the Maine. Even today, it still carries a bit of mystery to it. Experts years later have concluded that they believe the explosion was probably an accident, but nobody has ever been able to offer a possible scenario with enough certainty for people to say that this mystery has been solved. But that's how that's how it's looked at now. But at the time, definitely the majority of opinion was Spain has blown up our ship. Following the sinking of the Maine, President McKinley issues an ultimatum to Spain, demanding that Spain give up its claim to Cuba immediately and remove all land and naval presence they have on the island. When this negotiation, which really wasn't much of a negotiation, failed, McKinley then goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war. McKinley yields to the public pressure in April by sending a war message to Congress. He offered 4 reasons for the U.S. to intervene in the Cuban Revolution on behalf of the rebels. The first of which was to put an end to the barbarities, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries in Cuba. The second of which is to protect Americans living in Cuba and their property. The third was to maintain trade and business. And the fourth is a bit interesting or fascinating. It's certainly not the last time that we will see this argument, is that that this disorder that's happening in Cuba is threatening American peace. So, we need to go to war in order to protect the peace of America. So, responding to the president's message, Congress passed a joint resolution on April 20th authorizing war. Part of the resolution, the Teller Amendment, it was an addition to the resolution, which is why it's an amendment. The Teller Amendment declared that the U.S. had no intention of taking political control of Cuba. And it stated that once peace was restored, that the Cuban people would control their own government. So Teller Amendment is incredibly important because what happens at the end of the war doesn't necessarily quite match up to this promise that the Americans issued the Cuban people, who rightfully so were very worried of kicking out one ruler in order to then be invaded and having to deal with another ruler. So that's how America gets into the Spanish-American War. We will talk very briefly about the fighting of this war and then the effects of this war in our next video.